Hi everyone, my name is Anthony Caruana and on behalf of CIM, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. Before we start, I'd just like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and recognise that these have always been lands where learning has taken place through storytelling and through the sharing experiences. We pay our respect to elders past, present and emerging. We take that acknowledgement of country today very seriously, but we also acknowledge that today is about storytelling and sharing experiences, and we've got some great industry leaders with us today who are going to be doing that as we go through the webinar. As we approach the new financial year, we're bringing together this group of industry experts to discuss the evolving landscape of the office and retail property markets in Australia and some of the trends that we expect to dominate the industry into the next financial year and even beyond that. So I look forward to facilitating another lively and insightful discussion, and it's a pleasure to see such a strong contingent of industry peers listening in today. So to get started, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We've got some wonderful people here, super senior, super experienced, and really know their stuff. I'm going to start by introducing Davina Rooney, who's the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia, the nation's authority on sustainable buildings and communities. Davina's extensive sustainability experience ranges from environmental projects to not-for-profit boards and overseas community work. She's also an engineer with a lot of experience in building consulting. Richard Fennell is joining us as well today. He's JLL's Australian Head of Property and Asset Management with the largest portfolio of assets under management across all sectors in the country, along with a property management team of over 1,100 people. And he brings a wealth of insights and experience on current market trends as well. Ross Lees is Centuria's Head of Funds Management. With over 20 years of industry experience, he sits on the Property Funds Association's Executive Committee and is also a member of the Property Council of Australia's Unlisted Funds Roundtable. And finally, we have Dave Walsh, the founder and CEO of CIM, the world's leading building analytics software company. And it's CIM that's brought us all together today for the discussion. David was inspired to create the company because of the black hole he observed in the way the way data was being used inside commercial buildings. And Dave and the CIM team work with major property players across the whole world to drive operational efficiency, sustainability, and comfort. So to look ahead at where the property market is heading, we're going to try to answer a few key questions today. We're going to look at how the market connection to property valuations unfolds. How the market correction in property valuations unfolds. What will be the next key sustainability focus areas? How will investors, tenants, and customer behaviours evolve? And what are the next big things in data and technology? If you've got any questions today, please feel free to shoot them through to us via the Q&A. And if you do that, please, if it's for someone specific, make sure that that's clear to us so that we know who to direct the question to. So if you've got a question for either Richard, Ross, Davina, or Dave, please make sure we know who it's for so that we get it to the right person. And if we do run out of questions at the end of today, we haven't got to yours, out of time, we haven't got your question, please let us know. We'll come back to you after the webinar and answer it as well. So we're keeping a log of all the questions as we go along. Once the webinar ends today, there'll be a very short survey for you to complete. If you could do that, we'd really, really appreciate it because it's what we use to refine what we do from each webinar to each webinar. And be sure to keep an eye on your inbox afterwards and in LinkedIn and follow CIM on LinkedIn to keep track of when the next webinar comes up as well. So with that, we're going to kick things off and look at some questions around commercial property values. There's a lot of uncertainty being felt in the market surrounding the macro environment, with many projecting a market correction. So how is this going to impact commercial property values? Ross, we'll start with you for today. The challenging conditions have already started to impact overseas markets like the US. Where do you predict values will go in Australia and APAC? Are there nuances between commercial property verticals that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, look, I think it's it's the question on everyone's lips as to where do valuations go and where's it going to be now and in 12 months' time. I think one of the things that we have the benefit of sitting here coming towards June and thinking about the next 12 months is a little bit more certainty in the macro environment. Now, it might not be better news than it was 12 months ago, but it's a little easier to still, when we're sitting here 12 months ago, the cash rate had just moved from 10 basis points. But the forward market curve for debt was indicating it would probably go to where it is now at about 400 basis points. And a survey of 27 economists from Bloomberg had it getting to about 2.5%. So when valuers and buyers and sellers were trying to think about where value was going, there are three very wide data points that you really couldn't pick which one was going to be right. Sitting here at June, we have a bond rate that's persistently traded between 3 and 4%. Got a cash rate at 4.1 and a forward rate at about 4.2. So those numbers have all really started to narrow in and can give you a little bit more confidence on how to price things going forward. I think, however, the one thing to be careful of is to tar all commercial property with the same brush. And one of the big things that people aren't necessarily talking about is what's happening at the top line rent growth. So, capitalisation rates have to move. You can't have a bond rate go from less than 1% to nearly 4% and say there's no impact on capitalisation rates going forward. The extent of which they move probably remains to be seen until there's a bit more transactional evidence. But in a number of sectors, with what's happening in the inflationary environment and the demand environment, there's really good top line rent growth. Probably the bottom of that pecking order is commercial office buildings, albeit you have seen positive rent growth recorded this year. When you look through to assets like logistics, healthcare, retail, particularly retail and healthcare, we've got a lot of linkage to CPI. That's helped drive the rent growth line. And logistics, there's evidence of deals printing 100% rent growth on prior passing rent to current rent. So I think what people need to be thinking about is the whole composition of valuation being a combination of rental and cap rate, and not just saying, hey, the cap rate needs to move because bond rates do, and therefore the value is going to move in concert with that. As I said, the really big piece to be looking at is that top line and how you can pull growth out of it to augment that moving capitalisation rate environment.
So obviously we've got this quite robust environment that everyone's trying to operate in with, obviously there's been some mixed signals there that Ross has alluded to. So Richard, as property values are fluctuating, can you shed some light on how such market corrections might impact your asset management strategies?
I think there's really two stories here. Is those assets that are well positioned, have lots of amenity, and have had capital invested in them over time, and so their values, whether it be shopping centre, industrial or office, will hold up. Generally, they'll be impacted. I think those assets that are challenged, we've seen this overseas, where they don't have amenity, they haven't, they're not sustainable, they haven't kept up to current trends, they might be single use, so not mixed use. That's those challenges. They might be fringe in terms of location. I think that's where the pain is going to come through. And potentially that's coming through in that it's costing a lot more than what it did in the past. So in Ross's context, he's talking about rental growth. He's talking about cap rates, but we've got to think about costs. Operational costs are going up, inflation is there, and so forth. So that is eating away at the bottom net operating income, and that is an important part of valuation as well. So those well positioned, those that are going to retain their tenants and have spent dollars to be as efficient as possible and provide as much amenity as possible, I think will come through this better than others.
Thanks for that, Richard. That's really interesting. So, Davina, you talk a lot about getting the fundamentals right around data harmonisation. Can you tell us how these concepts can help property owners to stay resilient in the midst of a challenging market?
Yeah, so look, I'm going to come straight out and agree with Richard. I think this time in the market, you're going to see people sweat the real estate. Last time we had a really tough time in the property markets, the GFC, there was a question in office and retail, was sustainability here to stay? The answer is yes. It's an absolute fundamental in this market. So when you're talking to people about working your CapEx, your OpEx harder, the thing you're going to really be looking at is how you optimize your sustainability scores, and you might be giving the foyer a little bit of love. One of the things that Richard was talking about is a tale of two markets. We're seeing a clicks and bricks market. So we've seen experiential retail for years. The idea is someone can shop online, so you've got to have the reason to come in. We're now seeing that in the office market after COVID. Your team can work from home. So you need to have a fabulous culture and you're competing to have a better office space than their study. Let's be really frank about that. You've got to earn the commute with your real estate. So you really do need to be investing in this time.
Yeah, I love that. Earn the commute. I think you should put that on some bumper stickers. So Dave, what are you hearing from senior property leaders that you work with?
Yeah, I think, look, there's an element of confidence because people feel that they're in control, that there are many things they can control. There's obviously things outside of their control that external factors are kind of leaning on. But because we go back to the operational discussion, Richard mentioned it, like it's just now is a great time to increase the urgency within organizations. Like, it's unfortunate, but no one ever learns anything during the good times. At least I didn't. It's only the times when you're under a bit of pressure and you have to make things happen. And it's a very formative kind of process. And what we see now is technology is becoming an enabler. Obviously, we're in the software space. It's in operational efficiency. But inherently, every piece of technology and software is all about efficiency. No one ever installs software to add cost or add steps in their day. So there's the ability for the people who really want to get things done within portfolios to be able to kind of, a project that might have taken 6 or 8 months is now taking 6 or 8 weeks because people are just absolutely have to deliver those savings. And then the other one is the green premium, right? Like, if you look at, there was a touch on the US. If you look at in the US, you have lots of different market forces, but Australia has been quite a degree ahead of the rest of the world in operational efficiency, and I think it's in a better position now. And I think the rest of the world is really catching up to that. The fact that there is a green premium on assets, and unless you have it, you're in trouble.
I think it's really clear too. We are leaders in the world in what we do in the green space. When there's a green premium, I think that flows into just a quality premium as well. Quality assets are going to inherently have a better green rating, whether it's Neighbours, Green Star, whatever that may be. If you're at A or premium grade in any asset class, you probably have that as a given. I had some team in the US last week, and they're at an industrial conference over there, and it was leaders of industrial in the US that were talking about ESG being the installation of a bike rack at an industrial property. So I think it goes to show the gulf in which we have on what we're doing in Australia relative to the experiences that are happening elsewhere in the world.
It's a really good point. Sorry, Anthony. It's a really good point. I mean, there's a reason why Australia has been, Oceania has been a leader on GRESB since inception, has led the Dow Jones sustainability for the last 15 years. We talk about this being a Goldilocks environment, and that's because we have a market that's big enough to play and drive change, but fascinatingly, a market that's small enough to get around a large boardroom if we need to fight about a difficult issue. So we talk about this market having that real Goldilocks element, and the Property Council, Green Building Council holding hands and pushing together, and the rating systems working collaboratively actually enables more to happen in this market, and we're going to actually see that scaled when we look globally.
Yeah, I love that. We often look overseas for who's doing it best, and maybe the answer is sometimes we've got to look in our own backyard because the rest of the world's watching us. We're not looking for them. It's the other way around. So it's great. And I like the comment that Dave made in there too. I think you could summarize a part of what Dave said into never waste a good crisis. When stuff's going bad, that's when you learn the most. You learn from your negative experiences far more than your positive. So I think there's some really good lessons in there for all of us when we're kind of looking ahead at what's coming. So turning the lens a little bit towards sustainability, Davina, being on the board of the World Green Building Council, you hear a lot about what's going on overseas. What are some of the sustainability insights and initiatives that we could apply locally that you're seeing in international markets?
Well, when we think globally, I think it's really interesting to look at the global sustainability megatrends. So, carbon, absolutely up there. Buildings 39% of the world's carbon budget. circularity, circular economy, 50% of all materials used globally are for buildings, and health and well-being. So this really threads into some of the commentary that we're having at the moment. The thing that I would say that we're seeing that's really specific to this conversation about data is we've been talking about net zero buildings for a decade. We're going to need to talk about zero buildings. Otherwise, we're going to be building twice as many poles and wires as we need. We're going to be bringing EVs on the grid at scale. The Rocky Mountain Institute predicts we've got to build another grid unless we double energy productivity through that scale. So that's a real opportunity in this space. The other is harmonization. Your investors no longer want to read 14 different reports about how you're so sustainable and not be able to compare it to bottom line value. So the Task Force for Climate Related Financial Disclosures was so that they could put a number in your balance sheet for climate risk and change your future share price in relation to that. To date, we've seen a lot of great risk work done in this space, but there's a huge push for the investor community so that they can actually seek to value that number. And that's going to drive huge amounts of harmonization of reporting, frameworks, data. That data black hole that, you were referring to for CIEM, that just became a vortex.
And it's interesting. I think ASIC just put a report out today or late last week talking about the standardization of ESG reporting, and that it needs to be standardized so that people can do an apples versus apples comparison when they look at different organizations and different assets. So Dave, from an operational perspective, what's going to drive the greatest progress towards a sustainable built environment, not just now, but when we start looking ahead over the next few years and beyond?
Look, I mean, the whole data thing and the black hole and the vortex is right. Like data, like it all, if you gather the data correctly and you're able to tag it and use it and clean it, you're able to make data-driven decisions. And it's a term that gets bandied around, but if you can use data to inform collaboration and workflow, then you get the most important thing, which is incremental change. I read Atomic Habits, and the guy James Clean put it up there that you can make yourself 37 times better in a year if every day you have a 1%. You have a 1% improvement. Now, 37 times better in a year sounds insane, but 1% a day sounds very achievable. And really, just better data informs decisions, and but then with the workflow and the collaboration, what I also find is it really leads to one keyword, which is the kind of the accountability. And what you'll always find in any organization, everyone on this call now would have people in teams and stuff, is the real high performers within teams love accountability. It's kind of anyone that shirks the data kind of like scorecards or anything like that are typically the people who you probably aren't the right fit for a culture of an organization. So the black hole and vortex, once you get that fixed and you're able to get usable data out, the next thing then is driving it through an organization to get that operational efficiency. And the good thing is it's happening, right? And what also happens with that is there's too many areas to point even to one balance sheet line item where you get improvement. It stops multiple line items from kind of leaking cash.
And I think that's a really important point to make, is that sustainability is not a line item. It's a foundation that underpins many, many different activities across an organization. So trying to just have a sustainability line in the balance sheet somewhere is not going to work. You've got to look for where it impacts everything. So Richard, where do you see action on sustainability heading?
Well, we talk a lot about sustainability, but I think you've got to also take it into the whole ESG as well, social and governance perspective as well. So we're talking about data and, the cost, which is part of it, but there's a social element that I think is becoming equally, important, particularly after the health concerns of COVID. So we have a lot of health and well-being. That translates into real estate in terms of health and well-being in real estate, but it also translates into our social framework. And, Melbourne had, one of the world's longest lockdowns, and there's been mental health issues and things. And there is a place for us in real estate to actually think about the social frameworks, the communities we create, that whole ecosystem. And the data that we need to actually manage that ecosystem and help people connect and communicate and do all those things. So I like to always have that discussion is not just about the sustainability elements of energy, waste and water. It's very much about the social elements and making sure that we cover those off. And I see them becoming more and more and more important. And we can have a chat about governance as well, but certainly social elements, community elements are very important today.
So Ross, JLL has been a great facilitator of sustainable operations for its clients. What do you think the top priority should be for building owners in order to perform well in this area?
Oh, look, I think from a building owner's perspective, the key couple of things you need to be thinking about is, for us at least, is maximizing occupancy and then finding a liquidity point for your asset at the end of a funds or an asset's life cycle. So from an asset perspective, it's what are you doing to make sure you've got the right ratings in place in order to attract and maximize your occupancy, because as real estate owners, despite everything else, that's what we're trying to achieve, is filling buildings up so tenants can pay rent and we can pay banks and in turn investors after that. And then at a point in time, you want to realize those assets. And if you're not meeting the targets on various forms of sustainability credentials, you'll have a stranded asset. So that's something we're particularly focused on, is making sure at the end of asset life cycles or fund life cycles, you're maximizing that liquidity pool. And that's becoming a pretty interesting place, because there's a cohort of buyers that at the moment may not place a huge amount of value on it, and there's other jurisdictions, particularly out of Europe, that unless you're satisfying the sustainability or the ESG criteria, you can show a 20 IRR on a transaction, but they won't even open the book until you pass that gate. So I think that's something that, particularly as you're seeing secondary assets trade in the market, if they do, the liquidity trap that could be presented from not getting that right.
We have an audience question for Davina. I love this question because it's something that really strikes to the heart of a lot of what we hear and see from a lot of organisations when they talk about their sustainability initiatives. How can we avoid accusations of greenwashing?
Yeah, this is a great question, and let me give a bit of context. The ACCC, they're out. They say on at least a third to a half of websites they saw things worth following up. This is one of the number one things that we talk about at the Green Building Council. I think working with partners for how you can verify what you've said is true. So the key partners we work with, whether it's our friends at the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, Neighbours or Green Star, putting third-party verification behind your claims. Basically, it's got to pass the pub test. So if you couldn't say it at the pub without one of your mates laughing at it, or if you couldn't say it to one of your kids, that's a very good first litmus. But in any case, if you're making a statement of opinion, you need to have a position of fact ready to verify it. Obviously, the simplest way of doing that is working with third-party verifiers in the market like ourselves. But we've got to be careful that we don't go to the extent of green hushing, where we're not prepared to say anything for any reason because we're worried about, there being a question asked. So really defendability should be the case. If you're making a statement, you should have a logical reason with a data point to give verification as to why you believe that to be true. So really happy to unpack that further if that's helpful over the course of the webinar, because this is a hot issue right now. And we really need to make sure, as we have more interest all the way, from our tenants all the way across the media and mum and dad investors to, large investors, we're getting more and more questions, but we've got to be confident that the things that people are saying are true. Now, to be clear, the things that have been actually, that have gone to regulation where there's actually been a charge, have been enormously blatant so far. Social funds that weren't meant to have tobacco that had tobacco funding in them, a superannuation pool that was targeted at, no alcohol having a brewery in it. So to date, the ones that have actually, been caught up certainly wouldn't pass the pub test. They wouldn't pass my child test. And so, I think as we move along the curve, we've got to be clear that what we're talking about is fact-based.
I love that idea of defendability. Not just having an opinion, but having a fact that backs it up. Richard, another question that's just come in as well is, aside from sustainability, how can the ESG be targeted more effectively, and how do you see it progressing in the short term?
In the properties that we manage, it's about engaging with the community and charity and helping that community around it. So that can be as simple as creating connections with those around the building you're in and helping the overall community in whatever it might be able to achieve in terms of giving back. So we help with charitable organisations in terms of what they might be doing in a shopping centre or an office building. We encourage community days, social days. It can be as much as rooftop gardens and beehives and all those things that can go in there to actually bring people together and actually give back to those outside that need it. And there are a lot of people that need help. And so you can always find a pathway to that. And that's happening globally. The world is starting to turn to say, hey, look, we've got to be more community minded, and we've got to put more back in. And so there's many pathways to doing that. And
just to back Richard in for that point, when we get the heartbeat of community right, in every case, there's upside with the property, So I've worked with property partners where they've done a lot of community work in the retirement living and then had more referrals from residents, which is 40% of their pool of partners and the fastest to buy. I've seen real estate, retail groups put in inclusive place spaces and then measure longer dwell time, which is correlated to spending. I've seen residential put in great play spaces and draw more customers immediately to that. So, when we get the heartbeat of the community right, you're absolutely rewarded. Sorry, back to you, Richard.
I was just going to say it translates in the financial retention of those customers, because if they're connected with the community, they're connected with their place, there is an added level of engagement that means that the chances of them staying, which financially is so much better. Tenants who stay and continue on fiscally, it's in 9 times out of 10 the best outcome. You get that through that social engagement. So it's not all just fluffy sort of nice to have. It's actually part of an asset management strategy to actually embed the income return that you're trying to create.
It's really interesting. And that bounces back to just an old business rule that's existed forever: is the best customer is the one you've already got. The retention is always better than is always cheaper and easier than acquisition. So if you can create that community around a property, then the opportunity for retention increases significantly. And then also referrals, which are the best kinds of acquisitions that you can have in terms of customers as well. And that kind of brings us into our next topic area. Oh, sorry, Richard, go on.
I was just going to say that's translating itself into precinct developments and mixed use and all of those sorts of developments, because they want to add more community into it. They want it to be vibrant, more hours of the day, hotel, office, residential, retail, all of that, creating that community and vibrancy, and that leads to great precincts, which are good for the cities that we have.
And that kind of leads us into what we're going to talk about next. And we're talking about community expectation there, but let's talk a little bit about tenant and customer expectations. Tenant and customer metrics are the key drivers of asset performance. So it's business critical for owners and managers of commercial real estate to understand and adapt to the evolving needs and expectations of those groups. Ross, what are you seeing that's important to tenants today? How can this evolve? And how is this going to evolve over time?
Look, I think for me in our business at the moment, the biggest theme we're seeing right across all asset classes is the word convenience. And, the others on the panel were just talking about community, and that somewhat feeds into it. But really, everybody's looking for what's the convenience experience at the moment. And, that's what's going to attract people either into buildings or to stay at buildings. And if you go across all of the asset classes, the segments of the market that are performing and the conversations around, how do we make this the most frictionless experience possible? Whether it's an office building, we were talking earlier about earning the commute, if you subscribe to that or not, but it's about how do people get from their workplace to their office in the least efficient manner, because the commute's the friction point. So it's, do I have a quality office building? It's going to have amenity, be it the gym, the sandwich shop, the nail bar, whatever might go with that. It supports when I go to work, I have other convenience around me that makes that experience not just going to a black hole. The logistics sector, which has been by far the most successful sector in the country for years, has all been leveraged off the back of e-commerce, which is simply a convenience offering. Again, we're starting to analyze warehouse opportunities around what's my drive time to population centers, what's my catchment area from a warehouse. I described to some investors, if you book an Uber and you see 10 minutes on the Uber screen, there's a good chance you're cancelling that. That's how impatient we all are. So, that goes back to e-commerce as being successful because it's a convenience experience. And then on the shopping centre side, daily needs and convenience retail is the best performing asset class, because people that have to drive to large regional centres where they're taking an hour for the ingress and egress, it's not fitting into people's schedules. So, whilst you might look at who's my tenant also has a customer, and that's what keeps real estate full. And for every part of that value chain at the moment, successful parts of the real estate spectrum all come back to, can I provide a convenience offering for who my tenants are? So I think that's unilaterally what's going to push demand.
And that's really interesting. That whole supply chain kind of view of where the customer is, the convenience, the reduction of friction, all of those things. Really great insights. Richard, what are you hearing from your tenants around what they value in a space, and for retailers?
So retailers are very much focused on the traffic that you're able to generate, coming back to that demographic and on why the customers are coming, and that's about the positioning of the shopping centre and what experience that you're able to get, and is that convenient in as much as the shop local scenario, or is it there's a wide range of benefits of going to a large regional shopping mall and all the entertainment and the things that are going on there. So you're going there for the experience as much as you are to buy things. In terms of office buildings, the community, it's the amenity of the ground floor, it's the flex space, it's the things that you can get in terms of, we've seen a general increase in the quality of end of trip facilities, gymnasiums, other levels of amenity to attract and retain tenants and customers. So there's a wide range. In industrial, it's starting to actually also be that amenity story. How easy is it to get to, what sort of food and beverage facilities are there, how much amenity is there potentially in terms of organisations arranging for gym classes and outdoor things. So that amenity, that focus is coming through on all sectors, and a vital part of what landlords are being asked to provide today.
It's really interesting. And then just hearing those different views as well is really, really exciting, because you start to sort of see that it's not just about, getting someone into the place. There's actually this entire experience that building owners are now trying to create. Dave, when we talk about that tenant experience, how can owners and managers, enhance that as they struggle to get workers back into physical offices?
Yeah, well, so if you look at just the first one that comes to mind, Anthony, is the conditions, like the actual temperature. And the idea of having hot and cold complaints within a building is just madness. So I think they're going to step back. Probably a lot of people on the call wouldn't know what we do. We exist to help the people that operate large, complex buildings find and fix technical problems faster. And a hot and cold complaint inherently has some kind of a technical problem. And everyone's experienced it. It's absolutely terrible. It's terrible for the tenant. It's terrible for productivity in an office or in a retail space. And it's completely unnecessary, right? It's also negatively affecting outgoings. It's also negatively affecting the neighbors' ratings or any form of environmental ratings. But the key thing for us and for our part of the world is how do we, one of our largest clients, before we started, 60% of their tenant complaints were air conditioning related, hot and cold complaints. And thankfully we have that down now to less than 5%. And that frees up, like you talk about operational efficiency, that then frees up the management, the property or facility manager, because they're not getting those complaints. It reduces electricity or gas consumption. And it's just, for us, we're very much in that kind of back of house. The next one is the next set of complaints, and the next area that we take data from is lifts. They tend to be the second largest complaint after air conditioning, and at least at the ones that we look at. So getting data from them and making sure that those types of that type of equipment runs optimally is also very, very important for tenants, because again, if you're in an office space and it takes 10 minutes to come up after lunch, to get back up to the office space, and when you do get up there, it's like 26, 27 degrees and it's uncomfortable. We talk about earning the commute. It's hard to leave the studio at home when you can control the environment. So the good thing about all this stuff is it's all unnecessary. It's all completely fixable, and it ties into everything that every property owner is trying to achieve, which is less equipment breakdowns, happier tenants, and that's what it's all about.
Yeah, and the other side of that is, of course, that chances are that if you're dealing with hot and cold zones, for example, and trying to make sure that everything's comfortable, you're probably spending more money on energy in the first place, achieving the wrong outcome. Sorry, Richard, you were about to say something.
I was just going to say it extends to all things. If you take the Internet of Things and data and sensors, if you're measuring usage for the output of the level of cleaning that you need to do, when we do tenant surveys, and cleaning's always in there as being high priority. It's sort of the ticket to play, right? And if you're using technology and you're using that to actually work out where you need to clean and where you're going, it's actually productive and effective and works really well. We have a number of clients that have that sort of level of data going on, that they're generating savings, but their satisfaction of their customer is much higher. It's that combination. It is satisfaction and productivity and efficiency. And then you take that into governance as well, that data scenario of knowing, when the cleaners are there, and on that basis, how many hours they've worked, and if their salary is not lined up with the hours they've worked, then you've got the modern slavery scenario that we're all trying to ensure doesn't happen. The only way to do that is really through data. You can't do it through any other way, and we need to move the whole industry in that way across all levels to deal with those sorts of issues.
So, Davina, in your role at the GBCA, how important is sustainability and net zero to the tenants that you talk to?
Major driver. If we actually look at net zero in industrial, huge amounts have been delivered through Nike wanting to have their net zero footprint all the way down to their scope 3 and their partners' warehousing. And so I think that was a huge thing that's really helped move industrial forward. What we're seeing with tenants is their performance is far more linked than it's ever been to the success of their property partners. Now, that's for two reasons. One, the clicks and bricks do people want to return to an office place after the last few years? That really relies on a premium experience. So that quality of real estate that we've been talking about. The second aspect is with scope 3, people are being told that they're accountable for the emissions of their partners. And so what we're seeing is that if they've got a poor performing landlord and they're doing reporting themselves, that's actually a material impact. We're seeing this come really heavily into leasing at the moment. You know, if you look at the property council guides, for you to be classified as premium, A grade, B grade, down to C grade, you really need to know where your environmental ratings are at, and they call out both Green Star and Neighbours. But we're actually seeing deals lost right now at the large end of town if landlords can't meet their tenants' sustainability criteria. We used to talk about this only in the office space. It's now transferring across all of commercial property as a differentiator.
So just to add to that then, Ross, what's the rental premium for more environmentally forward-thinking premises that tenants are prepared to accept? And is that gap widening or closing in the current market?
Oh, look, I think people have used the term greenium, if you like, for how that green premium comes through. I think to the comments I made earlier, in Australia, we're that much further ahead of most other geographies. I think we're now at the point where I wouldn't call it a premium, I'd call it the discount if you don't have it. It's become just a business as usual expectation of having the appropriate ratings system set up within your buildings. And if you're failing to meet those standards, I think you're being discounted, and it might not just be discounted, it might be unlivable. And someone said to me recently, if you're not doing these things and you can still attract a tenant, you need to be questioning the type of tenant you can attract to your building. So because any quality tenant won't settle for less. I think one of the big advances we've got at the moment, my greatest frustration has been outside of office. Office is easily benchmarkable. We've had Neighbours for years, we've had Green Star for years. Industrial has been the great failure of the sector. We haven't had a proper rating system for industrial buildings, and tenants have been rewarded, or developers perhaps have been rewarded for building new and effectively cannibalizing secondary. Now we're starting to think about ideas around stored carbon and embodied carbon. I think that's a good step forward, because the tenant or the developer's been able to get a 5 or a 6 star Green Star rating for a new build, but they've had no acknowledgement for whatever they might have done to an existing building that's made it a higher standard or a higher quality. So I think Neighbours coming into the industrial space is a fantastic next step, and should help improve things further, because I think that's been one part of the market where tenants have probably been interested. Landlords we haven't been able to put appropriate ratings measures around it. So I think that's a big leap forward.
That's excellent. Thank you for that, Ross. And if you do have any further questions for our panelists out there in the audience, please feel free to put them through. We've been able to get to most of them so far. We're going to move on now and start talking about technology. Owners and managers of property must embrace technology and data if they're going to remain resilient in this challenging market. So, Dave, for companies looking to make the necessary investments in technology, what advice do you have as they search for the right solutions and then try to embed them?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, no one wants to hear a pitch from me, but if for as a general point, like, it's two-sided. You have to. There's a responsibility on the company for kind of searching and embedding technology correctly, and then there's a responsibility on any vendor. So, just the best thing you can do with any vendor is always just point to track record, or ask for track record, and just quite simply references. Then the next thing is, like, there is always a user of technology, and looking to independent user reviews is very, very important, because, there's an Irish saying that paper never refuses ink. So anybody can write anything about any marketing material, but a user, everyone are using technology that they really enjoy, and that flows through a thing called Net Promoter Score, NPS. So if a technology vendor can't point to independent reviews of a platform, then you really don't know what the take-up of the technology is going to be once it's embedded in an organization. And equally, everyone on the call would have worked in organizations where large-scale rollouts happen, and then 2 years later, everyone's underwhelmed by it, and there's been huge expense. And I think the Atlassians and the various different companies have changed that model by kind of being able to attract small teams and then grow within organizations. And that's because they built incredible software that people wanted to use. But so that's the kind of the searching for vendors. But then for the actual enterprise, you know, I read a fact that McKinsey once said that nearly 70% of digital transformations fail. And they pointed to things like lack of executive sponsorship, lack of cross-departmental cohesion and kind of collaboration, and a kind of a lack of management support. So I think if people are looking to technology to create that operational efficiency, then internally it's very important to be aligned to get whatever you pick rolled out correctly. Because if it doesn't have that support, and it's an executive's job to implement change, when you have somebody who's maintaining, let's say 2 or 3 or even a dozen assets, their job is to maintain the performance. But it's the job, the further up the food chain you go, it's the job to drive change. So I think it's two-sided, Anthony, to actually get the results. Good vendors and then good management cohesion.
Just to ask you a follow-on question to that, Dave, that's coming from the audience. Data is critical in all of this, but the challenge is that there are changes to software vendors, contractors, consultants, you know, all the people that are using this and all the sources of data are sort of under continual change. How do you achieve long-term data governance in that kind of scenario?
You just have to be able to, in a tender format, you have to basically stipulate that you want to be able to take, if you tender for this contract and we don't want you after a year or 2 years, we have to be able to take you out and plug someone else in. So an awful lot of the companies we deal with, there was maybe 8 or 10 years ago, there was probably a drive towards internally building a lot of kind of solutions. But I think now they've gone much towards kind of plumbing and planning, as we say internally. It's like, what's to plan for, what does the end user want, and then plumb in the right technologies. And the way you plumb it in and maintain data integrity is just by having the right sets of standards.
So, Ross, Centuria is a strong adopter of technology and innovation. What are some of the tech trends that really stand out to you as having the potential to influence some real change?
Look, I think the biggest one that's hard to ignore, and people in the industry taking different views on it, is generative AI and how that's going to lead into making operations much more efficient. I think one of the biggest challenges we all face day to day when we're running substantial portfolios is whether what is said on page 7 of the lease matches page 67. And when you go back for reviews of it, no one can quite tell you. And I think the ability to kind of pull mass amounts of stream leasing through on large portfolios and effectively audit, cross-check, and potentially produce those documents has to have a significant impact on the industry and again, reduce the friction and cost in how we do business. So I think that's one of the biggest ones that we all need to be looking out from a tech perspective. And then I think from a sustainability perspective, it's just really how we're capturing consistent data en masse across the portfolio to ultimately respond to the number. I know we made the comment earlier about trying to reduce the number of or standardize the number of surveys and things that are coming out of various green agencies. But when you start looking at all that, we're talking thousands of pages of surveys we're completing a year. Having the ability to data harness a lot of that is probably the other major one that's coming through the industry.
So, Davina, I guess one of the things that's kind of been alluded to by David and Ross there is that data and technology go together. They go hand in hand. How can building operators ensure that data is leveraged to its full potential?
And done right, they go hand in hand. So often there's a difference between data and information. So, someone might tell you they have 15,000 points, but if they can't tell you the so what that goes with that, you need to dump the data that you can't turn into information. You know, I'll absolutely hold to what gets measured gets managed. And, you know, it's a great time to be controversial. I think some of the sustainability indicators are some of the few lead indicators in industry. In retail, you find out after someone slips and falls that you might not have had your cleaning rotations right. You find out after a tenant leaves. The best performers in sustainability in my whole career experience, and a shout out to the amazing facility managers out there, they're punching on every metric, but the one that's easiest to measure is the sustainability ones. So your best sustainability performers across the portfolios, wherever I've worked, they've also had the best customer relationships, you know, the cleanest dock area, a lot of things that we haven't traditionally been able to measure. So, you know, I think in a metric where the first innovation was the brick, and we go back to the Egyptians, we haven't always been a great adopter of technology. So I think now's the time to lean into the opportunity.
Not sure what to do with that because you kind of threw us all in there, but that was very, very good. Thanks. So, Richard, how do you anticipate advancements in technology might influence asset and property management?
I think it's all about productivity. I think in the end, we just talked about, you know, leases and so forth. In JLL, we've already got AI-based lease scanning, so we can throw leases through, hundreds of them at a time, and it'll automatically read and abstract that. All those process and productivity things are starting to happen, and the data is being created. I think where we've got to get better at it is actually how all these things come together, which is what David talked about. How does the APIs work between these things in a seamless way? How do we happily share more data? We all tend to want to hold on to our data. It's my data, it's not your data. And still continually have building operations and systems where they want, you know, if you don't specify in the tender process, they want closed, you know, source scenarios and things. We've got to open it all up. And you've got to come at it at scale. If you're trying to just do it in small pieces, you just can't get there. So we've got to come at it with scale, bring big portfolios and big strategies to it, and be willing to collaborate and share across that to get the best outcome for customers.
Well, I'm going to ask everybody a final question as we come towards the end of our time. I'm going to start with, I'll start with Ross first up. What's the one trend that you're most excited about?
Look, I think it was what I spoke about earlier, convenience. You know, it's probably one that doesn't get talked about enough, but, you know, ultimately, you know, whatever your views on the real estate market are at the moment, it's an essential need in all our lives. You know, whether we've got somewhere to sleep at home, somewhere to work, whether that's the home or the office, somewhere to shop from, whether that's in a supermarket or online, or, you know, somewhere to obtain healthcare. You know, it's something we can't avoid is real estate in all of our lives. And, you know, the one thing I think, you know, going back a couple of years now to COVID taught us is we're all valuing our time a lot more. So the real estate sectors, assets, and locations that lean themselves right into being convenient, and, you know, from every person that touches it, whether it's the consumer, the shop operator, you know, the person going to the warehouse, the person going to the office building, you know, that's a piece that's going to significantly drive a differentiation in value between assets over the next few years.
And what about for you, Davina? What's the one trend that you're most excited about?
Harmonization, harmonization, harmonization. What it means
That's
is
three things.
there's nowhere to hide anymore. You know, that industrial asset, we can find out what its performance rating is now that Neighbours is leaning in, Green Star Performance is leaning in. It's not okay to report things differently anymore. What that does is that creates, you know, a rise to the top and a sink to the bottom. Under our own valuation reviews, premium assets, the premium's gotten higher, but I must say I agree with Ross. The greenium's held, and then there's a drop in value for the second tier of the real estate market. So there's a real opportunity to be at the top, but you got to lean in.
And Richard, what's the one trend you're most excited about?
I think it's the fact that there is a real delineation between good management and not so good management. I think all of the things we're talking about are all trends that you've got to be at the forefront of. And I think actually for what we do, being able to demonstrate that you can do things a lot better with the real estate means that you can differentiate yourself and be very successful. So for our business, we think it's a real opportunity, and we're very continuing to invest heavily in technology, sustainability, all that advisory piece that we can give to our clients, and I'm very optimistic about being able to differentiate.
And finally, Dave, but I'm going to throw you a left field question because we've just had one pop in from the audience. When we're using data, how do you make sure you've actually got the authority to use it?
Yeah, well, it depends. Like if you're talking about our world, which is data from the building management system, data from lifts, lighting, pumps, HVAC, sensors. Typically, like for a company like us, we don't take the existing data. We take a version of it. So when we sit down with the clients, we say, look, this is the data that you have. It's all unstructured. It's different from one building to another. Would you like to have it in a single pane of glass? They're absolutely fine with it, because it goes back to the original thing you read in that bio of mine that's about the black hole, right? If the data isn't usable, Davina touched on it, somebody promoting they have 15,000 points, but if they can't tell you, so what? When most property owners and property managers say, hey, look, if it's not any value to me, well then it's not that I don't care. I want to ensure that there's protections and data sovereignty, but knock yourself out if you can get me some behavioral change from that data, if you can improve the collaboration and the workflow, well then, they tend to welcome it.
So what's the one trend you're most excited about?
I think it is that kind of behavioral change. I mean, when we started the business to business, now our business is like 8 years old, and we're not huge, like only 70, 80 people. But like, at the start, there was early adopters of it, of our tech. And now as we kind of move across most of the real estate investment trusts and managing agents and stuff, you can really see that kind of sense of, there's a sense of collaboration and behavioral change. And we're in an industry, like, unless most people on the call or on the webinar would know how hard it is to run a large complex building, like, and kind of getting a way to communicate and have that ability to kind of have better decisions from data, that really improves everything, because everybody's aiming at the same target here, right? Nobody wants, like, if there's a managing agent managing a building for Centuria, no one wants to lose the Centuria contract. And if we've signed a contract with a managing agent, we don't want to lose that contract. But and the mechanical contractors, the BMS contractors, they want to do a good job. And the equipment manufacturers, they don't want their equipment breaking down. But unless you can get to the bottom of it, unless you can get really good data and get people working together across multiple different companies, then everybody loses. And inherently, who's going to lose? We have a pending climate disaster that we all have to kind of lean in behind, and 39% of all the emissions are from the built environment. This is something that we have to solve, right? We have to work together on.
Well, that brings us to the end of our time for today. I think the one big takeaway I've kind of picked up from everybody today is that, we're moving away from data towards information, and we're really moving towards insight and wisdom now. The collection of data isn't the big thing here. It's about using that data. It's that so what that Davina talked about. It's about gaining those insights and wisdom so that we can drive positive behavior changes, better collaboration, better experiences for people. When we start to actually understand the so what's, that's when we start to make better buildings and better environments for people so that they do want to come to work, that they do earn the commute, that they do want to come and shop, and so forth. So with that, I just want to thank our 4 experts today, for Richard, for Ross, and for Davina, and for Dave, for their insights, and for Dave also for hosting and putting on today's event. For everybody who's online today, please do take the couple of moments to fill in the survey at the end. We do use that information to, do a better job for next time. We think we do a pretty good job anyway, but we reckon we can always improve, and we need that data to change our behaviour so that we do improve for the next one. So please fill in that survey, and you'll all be receiving a link to the recording of this podcast, of this webinar after the event in the next few days. So with that, thank you to everybody for your attendance. Thanks to our experts for their insights. Have a great day.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.